everyone, and welcome to this, our third and final panel discussion exploring the essential role of compassion in shaping the post-COVID-19 new normal. My name is Sana Qadar. I'm the host of All in the Mind, a show about the brain and behavior on ABC Radio National, and I'll be your host and moderator today. On behalf of the University of Queensland, the panelists and production team, I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands from which we are variously connected today. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants and recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Over the past 12 months, life for everyone on the planet has been changed by a single event. In case you're unsure, it's a pandemic of global proportions. It has been a time of restriction and reflection. It has also been a time when our interdependence globally has been vividly demonstrated. COVID-19 has cast a new light on increasingly urgent challenges in society, the environment, and the economy, challenges that threaten our very existence. Climate change is reducing the inhabitable zones in the world. Demand for food is outstripping our collective agricultural capacity. And the increasing concentration of wealth to a privileged few is pushing greater numbers into precarity and poverty. And movements such as Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and the Extinction Rebellion also continue to highlight the most basic flaws in our socio-political systems. So, what kind of world do we want to strive for when the pandemic is over? And what are we prepared to do to ensure we achieve it? How can we reimagine the structures and systems by which we share the planet? In these discussions, we have been exploring these questions from the perspective of the human capacity for compassion. Now, if you've tuned into our earlier discussions, you'll have heard the definition we're working with, but for those tuning in for the first time, it's worth noting that the word compassion can suggest different ideas in different circumstances. But here, we are talking about something that is distinct from sympathy, which involves feeling sorry for someone, or empathy, which involves experiencing the feelings of others within oneself. Compassion has two interconnected aspects. The first is a sensitivity to and recognition of suffering and need. The second is a motivation to do something to alleviate that suffering and need. So compassion isn't just about feeling, but doing, and it's this dynamic partnership between sensitivity and action that informs these discussions. Now, today, our conversation will focus on the global whole. How can we work together to create a sustainable, fair, and mutually supportive world in which everyone can live with dignity, free from fear and the want of basic necessities? To explore these challenging questions, we have with us three people with contrasting perspectives on this common aim. And my first guest is Paul Gilbert. Paul Gilbert is the founder and president of the Compassionate Mind Foundation, a charity promoting well-being through the scientific understanding and application of compassion. He is a professor of clinical psychology and director of the Centre of Compassion Research and Training at the University of Derby, UK. He is also an honorary visiting professor at the University of Queensland. He has published 21 books, the latest being Living Like Crazy. It explores how, when we are faced with increasingly destructive ways of life, the cultivation of compassion can enable us to refocus on connection, well-being, and the social good. In 2011, Paul Gilbert was awarded an OBE for his work in mental health care. Paul, over to you.
Well, thank you, Sana, and thank you for a wonderful introduction. And thank you, all those behind the camera that have been putting on this series, like Alistair and James and Kay. So it's a great pleasure. What I want to do is firstly to add a little bit to the definition. Compassion is sensitivity to suffering with a commitment to alleviate and to prevent. So I think the issue of prevention is something I'm going to be talking on today, the prevention of harm and suffering. Now, we can see compassion in terms of a multidimensional process. It's not one thing. For example, you imagine the firefighter going into a burning house to save somebody, or a COVID person, medical staff working on a COVID ward. They're risking their lives, aren't they? So the two elements of compassion, which are absolutely essential, are compassion involves courage, the courage to engage, even at the risk to oneself, and the wisdom of knowing what to do. So anybody who thinks that compassion is about being weak or soft or just being kind or whatever it is, no, it's a dedication to the courage and the wisdom to address suffering and to prevent it. Now, this is extremely important, as we will see when it comes to actually how we're going to work in changing the world and moving it to a more sustainable future. Compassion also involves the prevention of harmfulness. Now, one of the things that's really quite important is to realize then that we can have compassion as a way of living. We can identify with that as an identity, which is to live to be helpful, not harmfully, recognizing that the human mind can be incredibly harmful. We are possibly one of the nastiest, most vicious species that have ever existed on this planet. I mean, if you think about the last few thousand years, our wars, our tortures, the Roman games, the Holocaust, we can go on, slavery, we can go on, can't we? So the first thing to recognize then is that compassion must not and is not naive. And that's where we get our focus on courage and wisdom to address some of the dark sides of humanity. Now, that's very, very important, because when we look around the world today, we can see that not only are we needing to have a more compassionate orientation, but we do also need to address some of the dark side of the human mind. Around the world at the moment, we see all kinds of political organizations that even today are locking up and torturing their opponents. We see today companies which are knowingly pursuing business interests which are doing harm. In fact, just today we heard on the news in this country that there are a group of school children who are taking on a fossil fuel company, because if that goes ahead, that will significantly contribute to the climate change problems, right? So this is fantastic. That's a really wonderful, courageous action. So what courageous actions are we going to need in order to move ourselves to a more sustainable future, which means to identify and to begin to address suffering? Now, one of the issues is that, in fact, the human brain is really designed for caring and sharing, and we evolved for a long time in hunter-gatherer societies, and that was good, and that's where a lot of our social intelligence comes from, our ability to speak and so on and communicate and want to share things. But then we discovered agriculture, which looked good on the surface, but with that, group size grew very rapidly, and so did resources, and so did wealth. And then, unfortunately, we reintroduced, because it was a reintroduction of primate dominant hierarchies, male hierarchies, and the rest is history. If you look at all of the major empires of the world, they've all been run with powerful elites that then suppress those below them. Many cultures and empires and societies have been run by elites that suppress the rest of the population. So this needs to be addressed, I think, quite significantly, about how we create a political system, an education system, and a business system that really moves away from this aggressive, dominant way of doing business towards a way of doing business which is helpful. Now, interestingly enough, there are many companies that are now moving towards this concepts of sustainable development, and they're beginning to recognize that we can only do that if we move towards a more moral, cooperative society, which is absolutely fantastic. The World Health Organization and the United Nations have now all published strategies about how to move towards a more sustainable future. So we're beginning to get the knowledge, we're beginning to get the processes that we need in place to understand what is needed to create sustainability. And nearly all of them address the issue about a cooperative world, not so much this neoliberal competitive world, which has really not done us any favors at all. So one of the problems we have then with the human mind is to realize that we have this capacity to be really quite harmful, and history shows that's the case. We have a capacity to be very competitive. History shows that's the case. But we also have a capacity to be cooperative and helpful to each other. But that needs cultivating, that needs sustaining, that needs very specific ways of engaging. So how do we do it? Okay, firstly, start with the schools. Okay, certainly when I was growing up, nobody told me anything about my brain. I had to kind of pick it up for myself, you know. we now have a changing in the way we think about schooling. It's just beginning, but mindfulness, for example, is beginning to come into the schools, social intelligence training, and also compassion training. In other words, if we are going to train the minds of the future, we need to move them away from this neoliberal competitive mindset, where actually it's all about what you achieve and what you do, into a much more compassionate mindset. Now, that's important because we also know that compassionate minds have a particular physiological signature. Okay, there are things that we can do that will help children develop the physiological mechanisms they need in order to have a compassionate mind that will allow them to be compassionate. Now, that's important because if you wanted to run a marathon or climb a mountain, that's great. Great ambition is great. But if you don't have the body to do it, you're going to struggle. So having aspirations to be compassionate, that's great. But we also have to train people, teach people ways in which they can orientate their brains and their bodies to compassion. Let's now move into business. There are a number of businesses now, as I mentioned earlier, that are moving towards a compassionate way of being, recognizing that cooperation is the way forward, okay? We're beginning to see this a little bit in things like the vaccine concerns, with actually ensuring that countries all over the world, we can spread healthcare, because at the moment we're struggling with that, aren't we? But that's our challenge. And then we come to governments. The last point I'm going to be saying about governments. Now, all of us have responsibility to pay attention to what our governments are doing, to pay attention to their values, to pay attention to whether they are pushing us into this competitive, me first kind of orientation to the world, or whether they're pushing us towards adopting values or supporting us in supporting values, which are about how do we create a cooperative, caring world, because really we're all in this together. Climate change is no respecter of boundaries. Viruses are no respecter of boundaries. We're as a species, we're in this together. And unless we get politicians on side to recognize that we need a compassion politics, this is what Jennifer was talking about last week, a compassion in politics, where politicians are directly developing policies that will help us work together for problem solving and not just go head bashing each other, because that doesn't really get us anywhere. That's what we need to move forward. So I'm going to finish on that point to say compassion is the most courageous, the most wisest of all human motivations. It is the savior of us, really, but there's a dark side to the human mind, and we have to address that in order for compassion to flourish.
Thank you very much. You mentioned that the dominant way of doing business is aggressive, often harmful. I'm wondering, obviously this works for a lot of people, it meets their interests. How can you make compassion an attractive option for them? Is that even possible? Or is it more about sort of longer term diversifying who holds power?
That's a brilliant question. So there are a number of things. Firstly, is this whole issue of sustainability, right? So what you need is also stakeholders, shareholders, your boards to take a compassionate agenda and to realize that actually long-term compassionate approaches in business are more sustainable. They're more sustainable because your staff, your employees, have more loyal to you. If you're compassionate to them, they're more likely to go the extra mile for you. They're more likely to stay the extra hour, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of evidence now that a compassionate run business is actually more efficient, is more sustainable than a highly competitive, callous one.
And is this really sort of, you mentioned schooling, for example, as one of the ways to start changing things to be more compassionate. Is this overall a longer term thing? There is no sort of quick fix to this problem.
Well, I think it's wonderful, isn't it? I mean, a lot of people are noticing that the younger people in particular are becoming a little bit more militant against that. Like in your country, you've got this thing I just mentioned where the children are working to take a coal company to court. So I think, that's the future, isn't it? But we need to support them. We need to help them, because there's a lot of evidence now that over the last 20 years, schools have become much more competitive. This neoliberal view of sink or swim, make it or break it, is really not sustaining to the human spirit. There's a lot of mental health problems in kids, which are partly linked to self-criticism and a sense of being personal failures. And that's all because of competitiveness, whereas compassion is completely the opposite to that.
All right, thank you, Paul. We'll bring you back a little later in the program. In the meantime, my next guest is Liz Grant. Liz Grant is an assistant principal at the University of Edinburgh, where she was a professor of global health and development, director of the Global Health Academy, and co-director of the university's Global Compassion Initiative. Her research work is in planetary health, palliative care in a changing climate, and compassion as a value base of the Sustainable Development Goals. Previously, she was the senior health advisor to the Scottish Government's International Development Team, working primarily in Malawi. Liz Grant sits on the Scottish Government's National Health Service Global Citizenship Board and serves on the executive of the World Federation of Academic Institutions for Global Health. Liz, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sana. And thank you, Paul, for starting the conversation off on compassion on the global stage in that such a striking way. And I'd like to follow up, Paul, with what you're saying around looking at the role of compassion in the Sustainable Development Goals and where we relate to these goals. Because, you know, we probably have almost all the science to realize the ambitions of the goals. But there's a gap between the science of what we know and what we should do and the urgent call to action, which we're seeing almost daily. And as Paul referred to, the class action case even today in Australia with Anne Shamar, it's that wonderful sort of push out. There's a gap. The biggest challenge I think we're going to face this decade is working out how to fill the gap, how to bring about a heart's and a mindset change at individual level, at institutional level, at national level, at international level, at government level, to begin to move the science and move into action. And given the urgency of the time, my sense and what you're saying as well, and I think the sense of these three conversations is compassion is going to be that driver. Compassion's the glue that holds the Sustainable Development Goals together. And underpinning many of the goals, in fact, is this concept of planetary health, which, to be honest, all of you know. It's so obvious when you say and hear it. It's that sense that human health is so interconnected with the health of the planet. It's interconnected with the health of the environment. If the air is not clean, if the land is not able to produce crops, if there's contamination, then human health will be impacted, and vice versa. What we do in the way we live is impacting on the earth, which is coming back to bite us. And my goodness, COVID has shown what that looks like. The Lancet Commission on Planetary Health, which was published in 2015, goodness, that heyday, so it feels long ago. But there's a chilling line in that commission. And the line says, we have mortgaged the health of future generations for the development gains of the present. And the shock today, the shock this year is we've realized we've actually mortgaged our health for the development gains of the present. And the question, was it worth it? Just under a year ago, when Dr. Tedros declared the public health emergency to be a pandemic, it's hard to believe a year has passed, and those figures now we have over 2.5 million deaths in the world. Just over 100 years ago, W.B. Yeats, an Irish poet, wrote during the time of another pandemic, the Great Flu pandemic. And he wrote when his wife was actually very ill with flu. And it's a poem many of you will recognise some of the lines out of. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. The poem's called The Second Coming. It was a signal that the systems were in crisis. The world was in crisis. It was just after the First World War as well. He felt there was no order. The falconer and the falcon had been separated. There was no togetherness. The world he saw was in crisis. And I wonder that's what we feel at the minute again, a crisis of separation. You know, the United Nations goals, those SDGs, they may have the utopia of a world that we want, but they lay bare the present world. They uncover the crisis of suffering there is. They're mirrors of the suffering that's going on in the world today. because the goals are really about brokenness, about hunger, about inequalities, about degradation of the land, the sea, the air, the forests. And they had to be written, not because we dreamed of this utopia, but because we created the problems. 285 million children are out of school today. Every day, around about 100 civilians are killed in conflict. Those goals are talking about suffering, but suffering we hear in the radio, we hear in the TV, we read in the papers, we know about. Suffering, but what do we do about it? Monica Warline and Jane Dutton talked about compassion as a four-part process, very much what you said at the beginning of the conversation, Sana, that compassion is about the interconnection between sensitivity and action. They talked about this sense as well of noticing the suffering, of interpreting it, of feeling what was happening, and then of acting to alleviate suffering. This four-part process. And if we apply that to the Sustainable Development Goals, and in a sense apply it to where we are in relation to those goals, to notice the suffering in the world and the people who suffer, to actually notice as opposed to just hearing or seeing the data, to notice that in Yemen, 20.7 million people, that's 66% of the Yemeni population, require humanitarian assistance today. But not just noticing, to interpret what that means. And that sense of interpreting is about interpreting how we play a part in that suffering. Perhaps that's one of the hardest parts, and that seems to me, in a sense, where compassion really becomes into action. Realizing as we interpret the suffering, we're part of it. We're part of causing it. What our industries do, what we do on a day-to-day basis, what we buy, the plastics we use, all of that is part and parcel of pushing suffering out to others, sometimes as we enjoy a different sort of life ourselves. Tragically, we have perpetrated and perpetuated suffering. But there's something as well about feeling the pain. When we notice and interpret and then internalize it, begin to register what that feels like. And feeling's hard. It's not, as we said at the beginning, compassion's not empathy alone. It's not just kindness. It's not just feeling sad, but there is a feeling component to it, being understanding, engaging in the heart and the soul. Compassion moves us, that act of noticing, that act of interpreting. And finally, about taking action. If we hold all of these, if we hold that knowledge, can we live today? Can we live without making changes in our lives? Compassion asks us to make a change. There's an evolutionary win in compassion, as Paul has made clear. And now we need to look at this in this new normal. And last week, one of the questions we looked at was about the social inequalities exposed by the pandemic, the unprecedented rise in abuse, in child abuse, in domestic abuse, the crisis of difference, the crisis of the othering. We're in a decade, as Richard Horton, who's editor of the Lancet, talked about, a decade of dichotomies, the us and the them, the nations against nations, the rich and the poor, the holding on to, the pushing away. And in dichotomies and divisions, they happen because we create spaces. We create the spaces that allows those divisions and to happen. And I want to just finally think a little bit about the spaces that we create. The spaces can be invisible, and they're often actually quite ordinary. It was Elif Shaffer talked about the rise in hate crimes that we're seeing across the world. They start not with genocide or not with concentration camps. They often start with words, with stereotypes, with cliches, with tropes. We need to be cognizant of those spaces. And we need to think, what would it take to fill those spaces, to create bridges across them? So to conclude, what does this look like in action? What do we do? Paul's already mentioned the vaccine equity issues. The vaccine declaration that Dr. Tedros put forward on the 18th of January, that to me is a real indication of whether we are a compassionate people in a compassionate planet. What do we do with sharing vaccines across the globe? That declaration is calling that every country will have vaccines to vaccinate their health workers and those most in need by the 7th of April. I call on you all to sign that declaration, call on others to sign that declaration, call on your governments to sign that declaration, because this matters. It matters because it's a health issue. We know that vaccines matter. They change the course of the illness of COVID. It's an economic imperative. But I want to finish with what Dr. Tedros says. It's a moral imperative. The world is on the brink of a catastrophic moral failure, he said as he launched this declaration. And the price of the moral failure will be paid with the lives and livelihoods of the world's poorest countries. It's a compassionate thing to do, to sign and to take action beyond. So in summary, in this new normal, there are many spaces that were already there, but those spaces have been accentuated by COVID. They have grown bigger. The spaces need filled. Compassion could be the way that we fill the spaces to bring together ourselves, to move from the us and the them to all of us. I'll finish with the words of John O'Donoghue, another Irish poet and priest, the late John O'Donoghue. And in his book, To Bless the Space Between, he says, we need blessings for major rhythms in our human journey. There's a power in blessings. A blessing breaks down barriers between people, and we need a blessing for the new time we are entering. What would your blessing be for this new time, a time of compassion? Thank you.
Liz, thank you. That's a great thought to end on. I did want to ask about the vaccine rollout, which you mentioned. It is, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, health story globally at the moment. And I'm wondering if you feel at all that it might be too late to inject some compassion into the way that vaccine rollout has occurred globally. And I ask this because, we know that wealthy countries are pulling ahead in terms of acquiring the vaccine, rolling out immunizations. A similar thing is playing out within some countries. And will that make sort of the inequality and the lack of compassion in the fight against COVID ever more entrenched? Have we, missed the boat already on some of this?
It's a really good question. I don't think we have missed the boat, but I actually really do feel very passionately about the signing the declaration, and all of us as community, as citizens, saying to governments, you have a responsibility, we have a responsibility not to allow this to happen, not to allow the greed that and the nationalism that's coming around vaccines to become the controlling determinant. But partly also because if we look at the stats with the vaccines, we know that the UK, that Canada, that Australia as well, we have more vaccines than we can actually use. We have ordered more vaccines. We also have this mechanism through COVAX to get a distribution together for many countries which could not afford to buy the vaccines. But it's shocking that by the end of this year, if very few countries in Africa will have been able to fully vaccinate their population at all. And it is a moral indictment that our ability to care for the other has suddenly moved into we want to have here is our protection.
That's right. Yeah. All right. We'll leave it there for now. Thank you, Liz. My third and final guest today is Peter Singer, author and professor of bioethics at Princeton University. He has written, co-authored, edited, or co-edited more than 40 books, including Animal Liberation, Practical Ethics, The Life You Can Save, and The Most Good You Can Do. His writings have inspired both the animal rights movement and effective altruism, and he's the founder of the charity The Life You Can Save. In 2012, Peter Singer was appointed a Companion of the Order of Australia, AC, for eminent service to philosophy and bioethics as a leader of public debate and communicator of ideas in the areas of global poverty, animal welfare, and the human condition. Peter, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Sana. There are a lot of things to talk about, and we were asked to only speak for 10 minutes initially. So, although as you just mentioned, I'm very much interested in the way we treat animals, and there's certainly a case for much more compassion there. I am going to focus on compassion for our fellow humans, as two previous speakers have. And I want to take up particularly the question of extending compassion to people elsewhere in the world, which again was a theme of both of the two previous speakers. But there certainly is a problem in how we do that. Many years ago in an article, I asked readers to imagine that they had the opportunity to rescue a small child who'd fallen into a shallow pond. It would be no risk to themselves because the pond was shallow, though too deep for this small child. There was nobody else around who could rescue this child, and the child would probably drown if you didn't rush into the pond and save it. But there was a small cost. Well, maybe not even so small. You had to ruin your most expensive shoes that you happened to be wearing and wouldn't have time to get off. Now, I've asked many audiences what they would think of somebody who just said, well, it's not my child. Nobody asked me to look after this child. I have nothing to do with this child, really. Why don't I just go on my way and forget about the fact that I've seen the child, and then I don't have to try to replace these expensive shoes? And the audiences that I speak to overwhelmingly, often unanimously, say that would be a terrible thing to do. You'd have to be an awful person. That would be quite the wrong thing to do. And I think people would, in fact, in that situation, those jump into the pond. But what about the fact that while we're here in our comfortable homes in affluent societies watching this program, there are people who are suffering and in some cases dying, not just during this pandemic, because I've been making this argument for back since the 1970s, but simply because they don't have sanitation or they don't have bed nets to sleep under, and they're liable to get bitten by malaria-carrying mosquitoes, which can be fatal for children, or they might get diarrhea and they don't have the very simple and inexpensive treatment to save a child's life when they're threatened with diarrhea. And in some cases, they haven't been vaccinated against basic diseases for which we have vaccines and have been distributing them for many years. And yet, we haven't been doing this, or let's say we haven't been doing this on the scale and with the urgency necessary to save the lives of many of these children. And this is actually a significantly larger number than the number of people globally who are dying from the pandemic, bad as that is. When I started writing about these issues, in fact, UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Foundation, said that 20 million children under the age of 5 died each year from preventable poverty-related causes. Now, fortunately, partly perhaps due to campaigns to vaccinate people and to help people, but also due to economic development in many countries, that figure has now fallen to about 5 million a year. So that's pretty dramatic progress in my own lifetime, or less than that, to bring it down to a quarter of what it was. But it's still a large number, and it's still twice the number of people who've died from the pandemic in the last year. So, and this is only children. This is only children under 5. Of course, many adults die from poverty-related causes as well. So why haven't we been helping those people when we would, I think, save the child in the pond? And I think the answer goes back to something that Paul Gilbert said when he said, we have evolved to cooperate because we lived in these hunter-gatherer societies. Okay, we did cooperate, I think we can assume, in hunter-gatherer societies, and people still do when they live in those small tribal groups. But we have evolved to cooperate with other people in a face-to-face society. Perhaps there were 100, perhaps there were 150, maybe 200 even, but probably not more in that tribal group, whom we would certainly help if they needed help. But when we get to a world where we have 7.7 or 7.8, whatever it is today, billion people living in it, and we never see more than a tiny number of them, they're far from us, that in itself, I think, is the barrier to us extending compassion to those people who we don't see. And so we have to ask, well, how can we get people to do that? It's not easy, but I think it's not enough to rely on the feelings that we've evolved, that sense of the feeling that we talk about with compassion. We have to really bring our reason into this as well. We have to think about, do we really want to draw a line between the child we see and the child we don't see, or the child in our community and the child who is in some other community? Do we really want to say that child's life is worth less, or we're going to do less about it? And I think that we can make some progress. I'm not going to hold up hopes of suddenly transforming everybody's behavior, but I think we can make some progress by doing that. And the other point that I want to add to that is, I think it's very important to inform people that we can effectively help people in low-income countries, the people that I've been referring to. Because a lot of people, when you raise this issue, they say, well, how do we know the money's really going to get to the people who need it? Or they may refer to some scandal that they read in the paper about some charity that was collecting money but wasn't really distributing it, was enriching the people who were working for the charity. Well, I think we do have an answer to that now. We do have research that's been done just in the last decade or so, independently auditing the most effective charities. And I think that this is really important. I think it's important that we find the most effective charities and donate to them, because the research shows that we may do 10 times, 50 times, 100 times as much good per dollar or euro or pound that we're giving as if we give to less effective charities. So I think it's really important that we develop an informed body of people who do this and who know where to go. You can go to websites like GiveWell, which does a lot of this research, or The Life You Can Save, which is a charity that I founded and am chair of the board of, but not running hands-on, that also draws together a lot of research to indicate which are the most effective charities. And I hope that in this way, we will actually continue to reduce the number of people in extreme poverty and reduce the number of children who are dying, and also improve the lives of people who are, say, too poor to get medical treatment that they need. For example, people who are blind because they can't afford to get their cataracts removed, when in affluent countries, really, nobody generally is blind because they have cataracts. It's a simple and inexpensive procedure to remove them. So I think those are the things that we need to do, and I think we need to spread an ethic that says we all ought to be doing this. It's not just about COVID. I certainly support what Liz Grant said before, that the distribution of the vaccine globally is a very important moral question that we all should be doing something about, and trying to urge our governments to act on that. But this is an ongoing thing. This is not just a pandemic related thing. I think we need to be trying to set standards where, for those of us who are at least middle class or above and comfortably off in an affluent community, we should be giving something significant. We should be not just thinking about spending on ourselves and our family. We should be contributing to these highly effective charities. I think we could aim, most of us, for example, at 10% of our income to donate to effective charities, the traditional tithe. That's a lot more than most people give, but I think that in fact, it doesn't reduce your quality of life when we take into account of the things that really matter to people's lives, that they feel satisfied with what they've been doing, that they feel fulfilled with what they've been doing. I think, in fact, for most people, the so-called sacrifice of 10% of their income, which they're then not spending on material goods, buys more than that in terms of being more fulfilled, having more meaning and purpose in what you're doing in your life. And I think we need to try to get that message across to get people to actually not just talk about helping others in other countries, but actually doing something about it. Thank you.
Peter, thank you very much. I'm wondering, when it comes to issues like global poverty, seemingly such large, intractable issues, I think people have a tendency to feel powerless to make a change, even, despite being able to make donations or the like. And I think of, the maxim used by a lot of activists, think global, act local. But I reckon, in this circumstance, that perhaps is not the most effective way to address issues of poverty. What do you make of that maxim that's used for so many issues, think global, act local?
I don't think it works at all for global poverty, because if you're an affluent person, then, well, I should say, if you're an affluent person in an affluent society, then people in your community are already so much better off. I mean, here we are in Australia, for example, every Australian can get healthcare, good quality healthcare, without paying for it. Every Australian can send their children to school without paying for it. Every Australian has access to safe drinking water. We are not going to die from diarrhea or something like that. And we have an amount of social security, if we can't earn for ourselves, that is already above the World Bank's extreme poverty line. Whereas there are over 700 million people, and it's probably gone up in this year of the pandemic, who the World Bank says are in extreme poverty. That means they're earning roughly $2 per day. So let's say $750, $800 a year. So it's it's easy to see that you're going to make a much more dramatic difference to improving quality of life, saving lives, giving people better living conditions, essentially giving them a chance at a decent human life by helping people in those in extreme poverty in those low-income countries, rather than helping people in Australia or the United States or the United Kingdom or other affluent countries.
Sure. And, for decades, we've had these calls to donate to poorer countries. This messaging isn't new, but it hasn't seemed to cut through properly. Do you have any thoughts on what the biggest mistake sort of has been for charities worldwide in terms of their messaging that may have contributed to the failure for this to be properly addressed, whether it's charities or governments? I'll leave that to you to answer.
Okay, so, I mean, governments, I guess, can't get too far ahead of their population, at least in democracies, or they're going to get thrown out at the next election. So I do think leaders have failed to take the lead on this issue, really. They failed to educate people to the extent about what we can do, about how effective our aid can be for people, and also about what have generally been in most countries, the falling percentages of gross national product that has been given. Australia is a very poor example of that, where we've been giving less and less for many years. The United States is very bad as well. United Kingdom, I have to say, is something of an exception, having got up to 0.7% of gross national product with a bipartisan approach. I'm hoping that will stick, but I'm not really sure whether it will. So that's one thing. On an individual level, I do think we need to inform people more, as I was just trying to do, about the fact that we do have independent audits of effective charities. We do have quite a lot of knowledge now that has grown about where you can give to be really effective. And I do think that overcomes part of the deterrence that we have. But, I would like us to practice more compassion for everyone, and maybe being more in contact with people through the internet and be more in touch with people who we are helping could be a way of extending that compassion.
All right, great. All right, I'll bring our other panelists back into this discussion. So I invite Peter Singer, Liz Grant, and Paul Gilbert to join us for the discussion. And I want to start by asking about COVID-19. Part of the reason we're having this panel discussion is because of the pandemic. And I was wondering if I could start with a bit of personal reflection from you all. How have your ideas about compassion been tested during this pandemic? Or what have you found most challenging about watching how things have unfolded around the world? And Liz, I might actually start with you, given your background in global health.
Sure. That's a huge question. And it's so important, because I think everyone has been touched in some way or other by the experience of living through the pandemic, touched from the grief of losing family or friends or colleagues, touched with the grief of not being able to be together with family or friends or colleagues. And I'm thinking particularly in the UK, because we our numbers, as you know, escalated very rapidly. Our systems somehow fail to keep track of the spread. Interventions were put in place, taken out again, put back in place. So there was cyclical work going on, but it wasn't actually capturing what needed to happen. And those who probably suffered the most were those in care homes, those who suddenly were no longer able to see their loved ones. And I have a lot of experience of working with people in care homes and actually being involved with care home care, and seeing many who were maybe at the edges of dementia, struggling to understand what was happening in the world, and then being faced with not being able to see their loved ones, but not fully understanding what it was that was stopping the visits, what was stopping those relationships, what it was that was causing staff suddenly to be wearing PPE. I think alongside the actual impact of the disease, it's the impact of the mental, the social, the emotional effect that the lack of information, or the information that was hard to internalize, or the struggle to understand for all of us what was happening, those are the things that we will bear witness to in the future. And those are the things that will really, I think, impact society going forward, because the very essence of what makes us human, to be together, was suddenly separated out with spaces put between that were very hard to manage. But there's so much more I could say. I'll stop there, because I know Paul and Peter will want to comment.
Yeah, sure. Paul, I'll go to you next. How have your ideas about compassion been tested during this pandemic?
Well, it's been a fantastic penny dropping moment. And I'll tell you why. It's because hunter-gatherer societies did well because they wanted to make a contribution to each other. Humans like status, and you got status by how much you contributed to your group. That was your status. What this pandemic has shown is that when people can make a contribution, they fly out of the woodwork. We had volunteers, 500,000 people volunteered to get involved with helping COVID. People came out of retirement, right? And I think this is really important for humans. And in my early work in depression, we found that a lot of people were depressed because they felt they couldn't make a contribution. When you talk to many of the unemployed youth, they say, who needs me? Nobody needs me, right? And I think we grossly undervalue the importance of people having an experience and making a contribution. I'll give you one example. We have these adverts in our newspapers where we see people looking very ill with their masks on, and then there's this little thing underneath the advert saying, you tell them you're not wearing a mask. Well, that's a shaming. Can you imagine if you had a person, an elderly person, smiling, holding their grandchildren, looking at the camera saying, your sacrifice has made my life possible. I can live with my grandchildren because of what you've done, what you've given up. Very different psychology. So I think in terms of what Peter was saying, which is brilliant, how do we actually help people understand you can make a contribution? Because if we keep shaming and blaming people, that doesn't work. We know that. One of the things charities have done is they now, for example, allow you to sponsor children at school, or sponsor a well, or whatever it is. And then you get little letters from them. So we have to find ways in which compassion will grow, very much so, if you connect people to their actions. Okay, so what you do here is going to do there. For example, we as a country, we have our aid bill, but there's no feedback into the country. Look what your money is doing. Look what it's doing. See what your sacrifice is doing. See the joy you bring. See the suffering you reduce. I think this pandemic has shown us more than anything else that humans function very well when they feel they can make a contribution and they're valued. And if we can tap into that psychology of our humanity, which is basically where we've got our hunter-gatherers and stuff, that's going to work. But if they, as Peter was saying, if they're just sort of faceless strangers somewhere over the hill, that isn't going to work. So the psychological trick, if it is a trick, is to bring people into a compassionate world where we all have a contribution and we can feel that our contribution is valued and we can take joy in our contribution. I think that is what the pandemic has really been a penny dropping moment for me, because as I say, you know, people came rushing from everywhere the moment they felt they could make a contribution.
Right. Okay. So it seems like you've had many reasons to feel hopeful through the pandemic.
I'm very hopeful.
Great. And Peter, how about yourself? Have your ideas about compassion been tested, or have you had trouble reconciling your thoughts about, you know, what governments or people ought to be doing with what has been happening or what people have been doing?
So I think what we've seen has largely been in accordance with what I would have expected. That is, people are helping others locally, and that's great. You know, they're caring for older people, offering to do their shopping for them so that they don't have to be at greater risk to go out. That sort of thing has been very good. As I said, we've not been good in terms of distributing the vaccines to equally around the world. That's a pity. But one very positive thing that hasn't been mentioned yet is we have had many volunteers to take part in human challenge trials. And I think that's an interesting phenomenon. So a human challenge trial, just in case you're not familiar, is the idea that you would be part of a group on which a candidate for a vaccine would be tested. So you might get the vaccine, you might get the placebo. And then once that had been done and enough days had elapsed, you would be deliberately exposed to the virus. Of course, in a facility where you're confined so you don't spread it around. And that would be a much quicker way of testing whether the vaccines are effective. And you could also find a lot of other things. So now, for example, we could find whether they're effective against particular variants of the virus, which we still don't know, or whether you can still transmit the virus, even if you're protected by the vaccine from getting symptoms. So there was an organization called One Day Sooner, which you can find online. The name coming from the idea that if you get the vaccine, an effective vaccine 1 day sooner, you're going to save thousands of lives. And that was started by a very altruistic person called Josh Morrison, who himself donated a kidney to a stranger, which I think is a very high level of altruism. Last time I looked, it had something like 37,000 people who'd volunteered to take part in those trials. Obviously at some risk for themselves and at no real reward apart from the satisfaction of knowing that they were helping the medical research needed to protect us. Unfortunately, I think the medical establishments have been very slow to take advantage of this. Just a few days ago, the UK gave the green light, and there is going to be a human challenge trial taking place in the UK very soon now. But I think this could have happened 6 months ago because the volunteers were there, and I think it would have speeded things up.
And I suppose apart from the pandemic and poverty, two issues we've now touched on, Paul, I want to ask you, in your view, what is the most urgent or pressing area that we need to be thinking about if we are to create a more compassionate world?
Ooh, that's a good one, Sana. Well, obviously, this pandemic is one of the most pressing things, and as Peter and Liz were saying, and you were saying, how to spread the vaccine around the world, because we need healthcare for all. Because vaccines are no protectors of boundaries, so that's important. But subsequent to that, we need to think about how we produce goods and services, because that's what we are, right? We're goods and services producing species now. That's what we do, and we trade and so on and so on. But we can't keep producing goods and services that are going to damage our planet. So that has to be the next kind of key issue about how do we produce goods and services that actually heal our planet, not damage our planet. It's not just stopping the damaging, like the plastics and fossil fuels and so on and so on. It's also about creating technologies that are healing. So you need those two things running together, I think, which are the big challenges at the moment, and getting people to work together. I mean, one of the things with the vaccines and the pharmacology companies, drug companies, is the issues to the degree to which they work together, as opposed to kind of competed with each other. And the issues about the different prices of the vaccines. I mean, the AstraZeneca one, for example, is grossly cheaper than some of the others. So there's a whole series of questions around how do we produce goods and services? How do we produce vaccines? How do we produce technologies that are going to heal the world? do we leave it to private companies, or do we need to have a much more global cooperative way of doing this? So my view is obviously the latter, but those are the things that I think are key at the moment.
Did anyone want to jump in on that?
Yes, maybe as well. I totally agreed, and I think that we can talk about climate change, and we can argue, and we can really advocate for that sort of the desperate need to do something about climate change, because as Mark Carney, who was the previous governor of the Bank of England, said that the crisis from climate change by the mid-century is going to be a pandemic on a yearly basis, the size of COVID. But picking what Paul and Peter said, we can talk about it, but unless the economic infrastructure is in place to produce things differently, to create a different sort of demand, then we're struggling. And I would add to that I think one of the greatest things we could do that would engender a compassionate world is education for children, is all children having access to education, and access not to rote learning education of the 20th or 19th century, but actually education that looks about what are the levers for change, what are the ways of living differently, what are the ways of living in community, of listening, of creatively moving into a different space. That the type of education needs to be examined, but also that access to and the investment, the huge financial investment we need to make as societies to share education so that all children across the world have a chance to be educated with the skills they need for a different sort of future.
If I can jump in there, I think that climate change is a huge crisis, and it's coming on us quite fast. And I really doubt that education is going to change behavior quickly enough. I think we have to look to technology to help us here. I think we are making great strides with solar photovoltaic, with electric cars are coming through, and with alternatives to meat. Let me get back to my concern about animals, but there's another side to meat, not just the animal welfare side, and that is that it is a major contributor to greenhouse gases, particularly methane. But we have seen coming onto the market a big upsurge in plant-based meat-like products. I've been a vegetarian for 50 years. I don't feel I need to eat them, but for a lot of people, obviously, they're not going to make the change unless they can get something pretty similar to meat at a comparable price. And I hope that will make a difference as well.
On climate, do you have any other thoughts on how one could convince, our political leaders to take it more seriously, more effectively? Do you have any thoughts on that, Peter?
Well, we have to elect the right ones, clearly, and that's the problem. I mean, we did have a huge win in the US election, and that was an immense relief, I have to say. I do not know that I or the world could have stood another 4 years of Donald Trump. But Biden, I think, is reasonably serious about doing something about climate change. I certainly hope he doesn't weaken. And that could give more of a boost to other leaders. In fact, the European leaders have generally been well ahead of the United States on that. Australia's present government is not very good on it, the federal government. But maybe, if the US really pulls in and the European leaders come in, China, I think the leadership is aware of the problems that climate change will cause for them. Maybe we will pull together and we will start to see the change that we need happening soon enough, I hope.
Yeah, and I guess that then brings it back down to individuals. We as individuals need to be, thinking about these issues and electing leaders that can make changes on these issues. Do you have anything to say on how we can more effectively organize, as individuals?
Well, I think we need to get politically involved. I think a lot of people are aware of the problem, but are they actually getting involved in politics? Are they supporting a political party that has strong policies on climate change? Are they helping it at election time to whatever it is that's being doing, handing out information on how to vote, talking to everybody else about it? I think we need a lot of grassroots action to change this.
Liz or Paul, did you have anything to say on that?
I think
Yeah.
one of our biggest challenges is the media, particularly the right-wing media. The world is run by the right-wing media. These are very rich groups of people who are part of the elite, who it's in their vested interest to maintain neoliberalism. It's a serious problem because basically they just stir up conflict and then they sell the blood on the carpet. And this is really not good at all. So we don't really have a media that actually brings out the best in us, I'm afraid. So, if we're going to get people to change the way in which they vote, then we need to change the way in which people understand and learn about politics. And one of the problems with the media is it's really pushed politicians, I think, into becoming just, Rottweilers. I mean, all they basically are interested in doing is making the other side look bad, stupid, and ridiculous. Well, that's no way for a politics, okay? But there are arguments to be had. There are discussions to be had. There are differences of view. And as Peter was saying, Joe Biden, I thought, gave a brilliant speech at this inauguration to say, look, we can differ. Of course we can, but we don't need to be Rottweilers and just tear each other to pieces. That's ridiculous. So I think the media is one big issue because they like that sort of stuff. And actually supporting politicians, I would give them a lot more psychological support, actually, to understand that the profession of politics is very, very stressful. I mean, I'm not sure that I would be able to cope with some of the attacks that people like Johnson and co get on them. I mean, and you have to think about what happens to a mind that they're being constantly attacked in this way from the oppositions or from the media. Well, it's a mind that's going to just close down, isn't it? I mean, it's not a mind that's going to be open up to question and to say, yes, I made a mistake there, actually. So I think the media, the way we do politics, and all of us need to demand a much more mature way of discussing difference.
Sorry, Liz, did you want to jump in?
I mean, I totally agree with you as well, but also to echo back on the education side, because I think young people are have the most extraordinary insight into what needs done, what can be done, how they can do things. But so we often fail to listen or fail within our institutional educational structures from primary, secondary, university to really listen to the voices of young people and allow students to begin to shape the future that they want and they know how to get to. So I really do make a plea for how can all of us do something different with listening to what young people are saying about the future they need to activate it. And Peter, I agree. In one sense, we've actively got to be working now to change. We need a green economy now that is proactively not just stopping climate change, but putting systems in place that will mean that we can make this massive veer, this massive change around, that we can pull ourselves away from the tipping point that we're at in these planetary health boundaries. But some of that is about ensuring that young people have the absolute skills they need to develop science differently. In computing, young people are coding now at the age of 11, but all of us will remember that computers were something that we saw somewhere else when we were in primary school or secondary school or university. We need to be thinking, how can we bring that level of rapid access to knowledge, say coding knowledge, how can we bring that into other disciplines and ensure young people have that so they can make changes to what they need to do?
All right, it can be a multi-pronged approach, I suppose, to encouraging compassion in many different ways. Paul, I wanted to pick up on something you said about the media and the right-wing media, and it leads me to a question that I've sort of been formulating in my head over the last, 3 panel discussions we've made, and I'm wondering, is compassion something that is, just a lefty concern then? Can it be dismissed as so? Not that there's anything inherently wrong in that, but, by those on the right side of politics, could it be dismissed that way? And if so, how do we reach them? How do we convince them that compassion is a worthwhile endeavor?
Yeah, I think it's a terrific question. And there's a question that's often asked, who has all of the compassion? And what we would like to say is that compassion is a psychology, that we can understand the psychology of compassion. It has this courage to it and a wisdom to it. So any political party that has the courage and wisdom to sort out a problem, that's what we're interested in. I don't have any solutions myself to particular kinds of problems, but what we do need is politicians who are prepared to address the problem, right? So this is like climate change, okay? So how are we going to address climate change? Okay, let's just try work that out and try and get a scientific understanding so that we can follow solutions that are likely to work. One of the things we know we need to do is to start to repair. So for example, there's some really interesting work going on repairing of the barrier reef. There's some interesting work on regrowing tropical grey forests, okay? So there are solutions out there, and I don't think solutions necessarily for left or right. The problem that you've got is not so much left or right, it's when people are callous, they don't care. Now, if you don't care, that is your problem, whether you're on the left or whether you're on the right. If you don't care, if you're callous, if you're indifferent to what's going on, and all you're interested in your own personal career and stuff, that's the problem. And so my view is to not let any particular solution be taken as a compassionate solution. There are many solutions, but the key is, do you care? Are you interested in finding solutions to these problems? Do you see these as problems that require urgent thinking, urgent ways of thinking? How we do it, we can debate that. So my problem is more the politicians who are callous. They actually don't care that much. And that's a personality issue. And I think, Peter, you talked about this, with too many people in politics who are attracted to politics with certain kinds of personalities. And one aspect of that is that they're more on the narcissistic wing of things, and they don't actually care that much. So that's our problem, really. If you care, then we can begin to work out the solutions, left or right. It doesn't really, I don't know the answers, but firstly, you need to be concerned. You need to want to solve the problem. Peter,
did you want to respond to that?
Well, I do agree that I don't think compassion is a prerogative of the left, particularly. An interesting example here is concern for animal welfare, and certainly there have been notable people on the right as well as the left who have been concerned about the welfare of animals. It's true that I suppose the radical animal rights movement now tends to be more associated with the left, but there was a very good book actually written about animals called Dominion by Matthew Scully, who was a speechwriter for George W. Bush. He certainly wasn't at all on the left. He was quite far on the right. And I remember when I was in England many years ago, there were conservative MPs. Richard Boddy was one who was very strong in terms of trying to improve animal welfare. So I think, that's a good example where you can get to something that isn't so much about the economy and are we going to spend more money and will there be more taxes, which of course is something that the right tends to be more concerned about than the left, but just in why aren't we thinking about the well-being and trying to reduce the suffering of a whole range of other sentient beings who are often very poorly treated.
Changing gears slightly, I wanted to ask, given we're talking about compassion on a global scale, Paul, I was wondering if you had anything to say about how culture intersects with compassion and whether there are parts of the world that are more compassionate or less so because of cultural factors.
Well, it's a great question. I don't actually know. I mean, obviously there are countries which are, follow spiritual traditions. There are, the Buddhist traditions and so on and so on. Nepal, for example, is much more focused on global happiness than GMP, that sort of thing. So yes, I'm sure there are different cultures and different communities that tend to be more compassion orientated than others. But I wouldn't want to name them necessarily because I don't know enough.
That's fine.
I think it's Bhutan, perhaps you're thinking about, Paul, that has the gross national happiness as its goal, which is a largely Buddhist nation. But I think, unfortunately, we've been seen with the treatment of the Rohingya. Being a Buddhist nation doesn't mean that necessarily everybody's going to be compassionate to outsiders.
Yeah. Maybe I'll rephrase the question slightly. In a way, what are the sort of inhibitors of compassion globally, or drivers of compassion? And I suppose in what practical ways can those inhibitors be, minimized and drivers be enhanced?
Well, I think in hunter-gatherer societies, the whole thing was your security and your safeness depended upon your community. Other people would support you. I mean, after the war, the whole idea was to build a national health service, schools, education, where we could all rely on that. And you know, for 15 years, whatever it was, from 1945 to 1960, we built a health service that was the envy of the world, and so on and so on. That was great, and people had that security. But what happened subsequently was the growth then of recognizing what it actually costs something to run a health service. Particularly the Thatcher government decided to pull out of that, and we then started to compete and so on and so on. And gradually the health service is being picked apart. I've worked in the health service for 40 years, right? I saw it was picked apart with tax cuts and this, that, and the other. So I think we can do that, right? But we do need to have an understanding that we need to create basic infrastructures where people feel safe and supported. One of the problems that you've got is that when they don't, then they want to have much more personal control over their finances. They don't want to pay taxes, you know, they want to be able to buy their medical care and so forth. And there are some economic systems that actually push that view. You can't rely on your community, you can't rely on the health service, you can only rely on yourself. And then that pushes this view, therefore, that I need to get the best share I can of the resources. And if you look at what's happened in America, it's the middle classes that actually are saying, you know, I'm concerned about losing out. What about me? What about me? I want my share of the resources. So you create environments where people are not interested in how can we create an environment where we all care for each other. You create an environment that, oh my God, you know, I can miss out. You know, my industry can disappear. I won't have a job. What about my kids? Blah, 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 blah. And when you create that kind of economic fear, because you don't have supportive structures in your community, then you're heading for populism. And that's unfortunately where we're heading. So the only way back from that is to begin to try as we can to get political movements to recognize that we need to create a basic sense of security within community. Security within community enables people to be less fear-driven. It doesn't stop it, but it enables people to be less fear-driven.
And Liz, in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, what are the drivers of compassion, you know, getting countries to sign on to those? And what were the inhibitors of countries expressing compassion and signing on to the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, and I think, you know, in the sense what Paul has said is the sum of that, the mix between what's in it for me and also the sort of, I suppose, the individualism in different nations that feeds into a political movement or a political will that supports a particular view. So I think that's part of it. The lack of a meta-narrative, if I can say, coming back to almost what Elif Shaffer said about stories, the lack of a meta-narrative of hope and of global family, that sense of togetherness, that's causing or one of the factors that is inhibiting compassion from being ingrained into systems, because even when countries have signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals and give you know, word of mouth commitments, it's actually getting the shift within countries to make the essential choices, make the political choices. And can I just say, Scotland, I think, is one of the, is a very interesting country, because our national performance framework is actually set around the Sustainable Development Goals, with at the heart of that framework, compassion being identified as the driver and trigger and the sort of the value base within which the goals will be delivered. But that's not the case for many countries. The other thing we haven't touched on so much, we alluded to, is where the financial industry is. And finance is such a determinant in how countries understand the capacity to be compassionate, and yet there's a movement within the financial industry to be compassionate. You know, not just mindful on Wall Street, but actually a movement from a number of banks saying we need to change our culture, the culture of banking. We need to change the way that we prioritize investments so that those investments are for a green recovery, but also a green recovery that's inclusive for all. So I think while there's despair in some places, there's real hope in other places of the recognition of the SDGs actually beginning to bring about change.
And Peter, from your perspective, what are the drivers of compassion on a global scale and inhibitors?
Well, I think inhibitors are fears of political leaders that they will get electoral backlash, and I think a good area where we can see that we haven't touched on yet is the refugee crisis, because there's certainly there aren't too many countries that are showing a lot of compassion for refugees at the moment. I mean, Angela Merkel made this magnificent gesture of welcoming asylum seekers, but even she got political backlash, and the European Union stance is no longer as open as it was. And certainly Australia has been very hardline and very lacking in compassion for refugees detained in terrible conditions on offshore islands. But the inhibitor there is that, and perhaps this goes back to what was said before, I think Paul said about the media, is that the media were playing up this issue and essentially creating the idea that we were going to be flooded with refugees who were queue jumpers and didn't deserve things, and they were not bona fide refugees anyway. And that may have been true of some of them, but they would of course play up the stories that they did. And so although at first it was the Conservatives who were saying, no, we're not going to take refugees, and Labor had a much more decent policy. Eventually, after Labor had lost an election or two and felt that was losing it, costing it votes, they went pretty much an identical policy to what the Conservatives had. So, that's really a big inhibitor, I think, that no political party wants to get ahead of the electorate in doing things that are good for the world, but not popular with their electors.
All right, we're nearly out of time, and there's so much more I could ask on this, but I want to sort of come to a close by asking a question I've kind of put to the panels each week. And, especially since we're talking on a global scale, it can tend to make individuals feel quite powerless to make change, as I've mentioned previously. So what would each of you want to leave our audience with in terms of a final thought to take home and think about, how can we all contribute to creating a more compassionate globe? I might start with you, Paul.
Well, look, firstly, pessimism is cheap. Optimism is a little bit more tricky, but that's the one that we require the courage to pursue. Look, if you think about it, it's much better to live in a world now than 300 years ago when we still had slavery and women didn't have the vote and so on and so on. So things are improving. It's very easy for us to see us all falling to pieces. We've got very serious problems, but actually, if you look from where we were with what the Romans were doing to what we're doing today, I think we're slightly better than having that, but it's hard, right? So let's stay optimistic. We are at a point now where we understand the human brain much better than at any other time in human history. We know the kinds of things that can actually push it to the dark side. We're beginning to see how we can train children in schools towards compassion. People are getting interested in the concept of compassion. So I personally think that that's very important. As Peter was saying, really choose your charity, join a charity, think about how you can make a contribution through a charity or some other way. In other words, if we can begin to live our lives more for contribution, that will make us all a lot happier. And if we're very anxious about our kids and our futures, that's understandable why we would be attracted to the right wing, but just give it a thought. Yes, I, like everybody else, if my kid's got a brain tumor, I want the best doctors and I want them to have the best education. So that's just normal human stuff. But we do need to think about, can we choose politicians who have an interest in actually the community and really basically the world community. So be optimistic. We are getting better, although we have one step forward and a step back. There are many, many people in the world who are working on these problems. Look at what, as Peter said, look at the wonderful things that the vaccine developers did and all the volunteers that came forward. So I'm pretty optimistic, but there's a struggle.
Liz, final thoughts on how those of us listening can contribute to a more compassionate world?
Sure. Well, I'm going to say, do sign the vaccine declaration, equity declaration, and encourage others to, and encourage others in your, people you're employed with, your neighbours, students at the university, really push that out. But also picking up what you said there now, hope. The opposite of hope isn't despair, it's cynicism. So challenge cynicism when we see it, and think about, where compassion is about noticing and interpreting and feeling and acting. It's those four things together. So as we hear facts, respond to them and encourage others to be responsive.
And Peter, finally, your final thoughts to leave the audience with.
Good. Well, I'm going to agree with Paul that we should maintain some optimism, that things have been getting better in many respects over the last 50 or 100 years or longer. I'm going to agree with Liz that you should sign on to the campaign for vaccine equity distribution. And I'm going to put in a shameless plug for my book, The Life You Can Save, because time has been very short. I don't feel I've had a chance to say all of the things I'd like to, but you can download the book absolutely free, either as an ebook or as an audiobook, by going to thelifeyoucansave.org. And you'll certainly get more details about how you can act. And that's the final thing I'll think of, that I hope all of you will be inspired by this event to act with more compassion for everyone.
Brilliant. All right. My thanks to all of our guests today, Paul Gilbert, Liz Grant, and Peter Singer. That's all from Compassion in the New Normal for the moment. We hope you've found these discussions helpful in thinking about how we can all work together to establish a post-COVID-19 new normal that is fair, sustainable, and builds on our innate human capacity for compassion. My thanks to all of our guests over the past 3 weeks, and to our production team, Alistair Foster, James Kirby, and Paul Purcell. I'm Sana Qadar. Catch you all next time.